Thank you, Rebecca.
Thanks so much. I thought that was an amazing paper, so thank you very much. And I think I speak for lots of us. I was just, while you were talking, thinking about different kinds of bodies and the issue of disability, which nobody will be surprised at my asking, because I think it would be unlikely from my own work to find women with disabilities sitting in the waiting room, even though there are higher rates of rape and sexual abuse of those people. So I'm just wondering if it's, you've kind of mentioned race as one important part, but I think there are other things like disability and different kinds of bodies that we tend not to talk about. Just wanted to mention that.
Thanks. Can I just respond to that? Yeah, I think you raise a really important question, and while I've chosen to sort of focus on race, my PhD is looking at a sort of much more intersectional relationship, because I think we know and we've seen by recent instances in the media, as a black woman, you can get grievability, but you have to be a certain kind of black woman. So there's an intersection there around sexuality, around class, and that kind of thing. But I think what you're also pointing to is that the way in which different kind of bodies interact with different notions of different kinds of rape as well. And so there are many barriers for example, the kind of work that I want to do to talk to women who are in a sort of supportive environment, for example, like an organization through Rape Crisis. We know that we're only getting access to some women. I mean, I think in all the time that I was a counselor there, I only ever saw one woman that was raped by her partner. The rest were all women who'd been raped by strangers. And so we know that it's easier to report that kind of rape because it feeds into these kind of colonial discourses of black peril and sort of the stranger in the night. And so, they're not only barriers in terms of sort of individual intersectionality or individual positioning, but also the way in which that interacts with sort of dominant ideas about what is and what isn't rape, and who isn't a legitimate victim.
Thank you, Rebecca. Absolutely incredible and powerful and touching and awakening all sorts of places in me. But I want to know if you have begun to think about how we can work this kind of awareness, this consciousness about rape and subjectivity, rape, race and subjectivity, into how the public health system responds to the rape of black women. So because I come from public health arena, I'm very pragmatic. I think that's why I even asked the question I asked earlier. So we talk about decolonization, how do we then move from that to, getting funding? So I'm just wondering, do you think, have you begun to think about that? Yeah.
Thanks for that comment. I mean, I've begun to think about it in relation to some of the other experiences that I had while I was at the Hedefeld to Gisela Care Center, because I was sort of back and forth. And there were other instances where things happened, for example, where there were children with a caretaker or a parent, a black child and a black parent. And the policeman was just interviewing this woman about the rape of her child in the middle of the waiting room. Just like it was like not and asking her where she'd been, So I think in that way, there is a sort of space for a sort of sensitization training about the way in which we sort of reaffirm people's trauma, or we sort of dismiss it and reaffirm it in a sort of very complicated way, just by those kind of very small sort of interactions. And obviously there's a sort of another dynamic at play where perhaps that nurse had never seen a white woman. I mean, I remember the night that I was raped, I phoned like my entire family and they were all there, and I could just see the staff just had no idea what to do. Why were all these white people like in their clinic? They just, whereas often it's women who come by themselves and that kind of thing. So I think that, in a very sort of practical way, that kind of work can happen around sort of desensitization training. But for me, the harder work is how do you disrupt the sort of discursive representations of black women as sort of always already raped. And I think we sort of see it repeatedly, and I put a picture up here of this book at the bottom here, it was written by someone that I know, who I'm the girl who was raped, and also this book, Alice and I Have Life. And the fact that, you know, these sell a lot of copies and people want to read them, because it's a tellable story that feeds into this kind of panic about black men as rapists. Although in Alison's case, she was raped by white men, but particularly sort of deviant white men that are constructed in a particular way. So how do we disrupt this notion that certain rapes are sort of tellable and grievable in sort of much broader and often less concrete ways? I think that's some of the work that I'm sort of struggling with in relation to my PhD. And about my own experience, about how I'm taking up a lot of space away from other, so how do I tell my story in a way that doesn't reinforce this notion that by being raped by a black man, like that I don't reinforce this notion that, all black men are rapists? Because I know people are going to want to hear that kind of story.
Hello? I think we sort of spoke about this in the low PhD seminar thing we have. But my question is sort of linked to what happened at Rhodes last year. Because I was there and you sort of had to deal with the number of protests. But there was a protest there that was called, for anybody who didn't know, the RU reference-less protest. One of the most precarious things about what was happening there was that all, if not most, but I'm certain, just sort of trying to remember the names that were on that list, that all of the men that were on there were black. So I started asking the question amongst colleagues around, are only black men committing rape? Are black women finding a voice more? But also, sort of from the discussion last week with Rebecca, I started asking myself about almost the silencing, or so in a public forum of white women who do get raped, and how sort of these subjectivities play a role in sort of doing that, and who speaks and why that person gets to speak more than another person, whether it's about sort of reinforcing that kind of idea again, that sort of black women are raped more, and so we must have that kind of discussion more than we would have another one.
What I think is amazing in the work that I've done, predominantly the counseling work, and I've spoken about this to Kopano and Sipo and some other colleagues, is that despite all the barriers that black women experience, they still seek help. They still will, walk into clinics, and they still, I think, are trying really hard to get access to the kind of equality and justice that they've been promised. And I think that's the kind of thing that we see in these kind of protests that are being led by young black women. It's about a demanding for delivery on that. But at the same time, this notion of it's not only about who can be raped, but it's about who can be a rapist. And so in sort of broader discourses about black men as rapists, it's possible for both black women and white women to accuse black men. But because of discourses of colonialism, I mean, the sort of most basic example is that a white man could actually not be convicted of raping his slave. And in a lot of countries in the world, still you can't be convicted of raping your wife. And so this this rape perpetrated by white men, and by particular white men, often men who are partners or husbands or relatives, is still unspeakable. And so I definitely don't think it's the case that more black women are raped, but that there's certain dynamics happening in society which, despite all the dehumanization that happens to black women, where they still feel that they can sort of speak out about it. And I think, for me, in preparing for this presentation, this notion of whiteness and respectability has become, I've been able to sort of see the power of it. And I think, in some sense, without really being able to sort of equate or create a sort of numerical comparison, the cost for white women of reporting particular kinds of rape is somehow higher, because they are violating that notion of white respectability, which is very sort of central to notions of gender and also personhood. So I think that that's might be what we're seeing sort of playing out at Rhodes, and yeah.
I want to ask something, and it is linked to the dignifying of black people. Whether it would be helpful to study the rapes of white people more. And when I'm asking this question, it takes me back to what we spoke about in May, where we said that experiences have no skin color at all. That everybody, but the voice of everyone must be heard. So if we study the rapes of white people, would it not then also put to the fore that the experiences of black people are not, can I say, normal? That their rapes are not normal. So what I'm not sure if I'm putting it across well, that we need to study the bad experiences of white people as much as we will study the bad experiences of white people, to dignify and humanize the bad experiences of black people.
Thanks, Nazisa. I think that is an important point. And while I agree that, and in my study, it would be great to be able to access white women as well, although I may be able to access some, I think that probably I'm only going to get a particular kind of white woman. And by that I mean a white woman who's been raped by a black man, because of these sort of broader discourses of unspeakability and grievability and sort of recognition. So I think that is a really important point, but the sort of practical and structural constraints make that quite difficult. And so we need to think of sort of more creative ways of subverting that, so we don't reproduce this. And I guess that's what I'm trying to sort of destabilize a bit in my PhD, by putting myself at the center and saying that this happens to white women as well, even though I recognize that my rape is a particular kind of rape. But at the same time, when we say that this can happen to black and white people, and particularly black and white women, I think we mustn't forget that the meanings of those experiences become different, or are created and read as different. And so there's a need to engage with that, and that's what I'm trying to do, I guess, with the intersectional lens. That for me to go to the clinic and to be able to demand that if something doesn't happen, I don't know, my aunt phones the brigadier or whatever, and I knew exactly what was going to happen. I knew about the rape kit. I knew which police must come. I had way more power and control than most women ever have in that kind of situation. And the way in which I was able to tell those people around me, I phoned a family member of mine 5 minutes after the rape and said, this is what's happened. Like, can you just come and, I'm going to the police station, can you come and help me? And that would have been that is an unthinkable thing for a lot of women. And so it's about a balance about saying this happens to everyone, but the meaning of it and the way in which you yourself are able to experience it is very much tied up with who you are.
Thank you, Rebecca. A very powerful presentation. So many questions, but I'm trying to think of what to ask. I'm just wondering, I'm thinking about how you've juxtaposed the rape and killing of a black woman as opposed to a white woman, and this question of ungrievability, and also thinking about the effect, in a sense. I don't think effect is the right word, but of this idea that the rape and the death, the rape and often the death of a black woman is less grievable than a white woman. And in my work where I've spoken about, and in Boyson, I did the kind of, spoke about the killing of Riva Steenkamp, who was afforded a particular kind of white femininity, but fuller subjectivity, in a sense. And I think the media play a huge role in perpetuating the kinds of discourses that we see. And so I'm just wondering if you've interrogated that in any way, or if you can provide any comment on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there are two sort of key points, and I'm not the first to make at least the second one. But so I've been thinking about what that does in the moment in the waiting room, where I don't do anything, the nurse reinforces this, and that young woman just has to sit there. And so it creates this very precarious position for her, where her trauma is sort of diminished or sort of made inevitable, but that may not be her experience of her sort of own trauma. And so it becomes unspeakable sort of on various levels. And I think that, creates, also these notions of sort of shame and blame and that kind of thing. I mean, they always tell you that women always blame themselves. And I wasn't convinced that was true, until my own rape, where I've relived the moments over and over again in which I should have done this and I should have done that and I should have done that. But never has that been reinforced for me by, anyone around me. So for your rape to be constructed as inevitable and sort of your own fault, and why it just creates a traumatic crisis that I think is, and then what happens when you see the way in which other women, either like you, are subjected to the same thing, or other women who are not like you are grievable in a kind of different way. I think that sort of makes it far more complicated. And then, as I alluded to, what Pullman Kala talks about is that it makes black women safe to rape, because both black and white men see that the consequence and the social value of those lives is less. And so, I think we've just seen this in the Franziska Blochlinger case, where he got like 3 life sentences or something. I think had she been someone else, and the public pressure to do something about a real horrifying rape, that's a sort of real motivator. So I think that at the level of the individual, but also our sort of social consciousness. And for me, I've gone back to engage with what it means to be grievable in a context where a lot of other women are ungrievable. And when I see that, that kind of representation, it has a slightly different effect on me than I think that, I'm not saying only on me, but as our society as a whole. And so you're placed in a very precarious position as to how you can respond to that, or how your response sort of is recognized. So I've been writing about, and I guess trying to use my white privilege for good, about what happens to, why are we not talking about these other women? Why does everyone want to read my blog about my experience, but no one wants to read, about other women?
Well, we have allowed silence so that Rebecca's presentation sort of sinks in. The question it raises for me in concluding and having you conclude the session is, you want to put up that Michelle Hattinger's book. I got the book through Rebecca. And it's an okay book, but I would recommend it, not for the reasons that it's now being made into a film, I think. At least they sold the rights to the book. But there's 2 rapes that are in the book. But the first rape is not called rape until the second rape happens, right?
It's not even then called rape.
It's not called rape. So the second rape is the rape by a black man. The first rape, which is called coercion, right, is by acquaintance, a friend, a white person. And this, of course, has raised the questions we've been interacting around. There must be a lot of rapes, a lot of coercive sex in our society among young white women, young white men, as Sipa was saying, that are just unspoken. And this is most incredible. Then the moment you start to read the literature around sexual violence that's produced here at the MRC and elsewhere in the country, you start to realize this symmetry of bodies that can never quite articulate until something happens. Because in that moment, what happens is precisely what Rebecca is saying. Rape looks in a particular way. This is what, again, Pomla Dinalkola is saying. Rape looks like this. A rapist looks like this. A raped woman is this kind of woman. And I have been asking in interactions with Rebecca to do this more, because what she's presenting to us in a PhD is just not this event, but how it seeps in and leaks into the constitution of whiteness and blackness and, if you will, the nation state. But the silences I've been trying to allow is precisely because how do we afford to be happy, to live in a country where you have a symmetry of unspoken violence, but also about the kinds of way we treat people who are raped, whether children, from the police to the hospitals, or the youngest. It boggles my mind every time I concentrate on this fact that Rebecca was saying, I mean, the event right there. How is it possible to live in this country, as women particularly? But also, of course, because I work on men, precisely about the unacknowledged trauma that they grow up with. I mean, the one key variable that's associated with rape. In the latest study by Song, it's 5 times. So people who have witnessed or have been severely punished as children. So men who are severely punished or have witnessed violence or have been sexually abused are more likely to rape. So that part of the equation sometimes doesn't get lifted as much, because clearly if we have these children who are violated 20 years down the line, you're going to continue to witness that. Last words, Rebecca?
Yeah, I think going to what Kapane says, but also another thought that I've been having, that I've been writing about, is how do we do this work about sexual violence and lift up the violation, the trauma, without reinscribing that? Because I remember at this incident, I was present at this incident that Michelle writes about in her book, and someone came running back to tell us what had happened, and he said, the worst thing has happened. They've been raped. And sort of right before my own rape, I heard that in my head. The worst thing is about to happen to you. And how do you reconstitute the self in that context? So it's, again, a precarious position between acknowledging the trauma and the harm that happens, but not sort of reinscribing that in a way that it comes to define, who you are.
Shall we take lunch? And thank you, Rebecca. Wonderful.
Thanks, Tony.